Let's get more now on the women and children linked to Islamic State fighters that are returning to Australia today. Dylan Welch is an investigative journalist with Four Corners. He met and spoke with the women in a detention camp in northeastern Syria in 2019 and is with us now. Very good morning to you, Dylan. Thanks for your time.
You're welcome, Kath.
If I can take you back to 2019 when you visited women and children in these camps in Syria, what was it like there? What were the conditions like?
They were awful. I mean, you have to remember that when we got there, we went there twice in 2019, once when it was bitterly cold, once when it was very, very hot. This is the Middle Eastern desert. All of the Australian women there at the time, at its peak, I think there were almost 70 women and children. They had just escaped the fall of ISIS, and what that meant for them was a brutal, brutal battle in a small town in eastern Syria called Bahrouz, where there had been just relentless bombardment by the Americans and by their Kurdish allies for weeks. So by the time they got to the camps, they were, wounded, they were terrified, they were starving, and what greeted them at the camps was not much better. When we got there, they were, diarrhoea and various other transmissible diseases were rife. They were living in very small tents with no heating. From memory, they were right next to a pit where people used to go to the toilet during the day and in the night. So it was just, it was really awful conditions.
What is your understanding of how these women and children came to this situation, how they came to Syria?
Well, so we obviously spoke to all of them when we were there in one way or another. Almost all of them, to a woman, described situations where they were lured there. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of those stories are true. I think some of them probably were, some of them probably weren't. Some of them probably did choose to go there. They didn't tell us that, I think, because it would have exposed them to charges back home in Australia. But I think equally there were also some of those women who did not intend to go to Syria. They did intend to go to Turkey, where they wanted to provide assistance to refugees. And they were then told to go somewhere, and the next thing they knew, they were in Syria. That may sound unbelievable to some people, but I've heard a lot of stories in that period, and I would say that's certainly something that happened to a lot of people.
They have, there are reports, they've told the ABC that they were keen to come back home to Australia, and the ones that are returning, they have quotes from the ones that are returning today. But when you met these women, 7 years ago, did they want to return home to Australia then? Yeah,
they absolutely did. All they wanted was to come home, and I do mean home, because for most of them, a lot of them, they'd not left Australia, or perhaps had gone on brief trips overseas before they went to Syria. They were desperate to come home then, and for instance, one of the women that will be coming home today is Janai Safar. She had a 2-year-old child with her when we spoke to her then. That child would now be, I presume, about 9. So both Janai and her child have endured 7 years. That child has essentially grown up in that camp, or in one of 2 camps. And the experience would have been just awful. There was another woman, Shaima Assad. She was taken to Syria by her family when she was 13, married off. By the time we met her, from memory, she was 17, and she'd had 3 children, so 3 children in 4 years, and I think that's to 3 different men, because each of her husbands subsequently in line were killed in fighting. Now, she went home in 2022, but equally those children grew up most of their lives until they came home in those camps.
Would these women be aware of what awaits them when they land in Melbourne and Sydney tonight? The AFP Commissioner has warned that some of these individuals will be arrested. They will face charges including terrorism offences and some crimes against humanity, and some of their children then will be left to be looked after, presumably by other family members.
Yeah, I think they've had a lot of time to prepare. When we were speaking to people, in fact, again, I spoke to Janai Safar's grandfather back in 2019, who was in Australia, And he said to me then, look, we just want them to come home to Australia. If that means they're going to be charged and sent to jail, we'll bear that. At least it means we can go visit them in jail. They've been aware that there is the possibility, in fact, the probability for some of them, that they will be charged and possibly jailed. That did not in any way affect their desire to come home.
In a statement, the Victoria Premier, Victoria Allen, said Victoria Police are working with the AFP to ensure the safety of all Victorians. There is concern amongst some area of the communities about the return of these women and children, the concern about if they might have potentially been radicalised. In your opinion, with them returning home, are Australians safe?
These women, when they were in Syria, were mothers. They were kept in houses, very rarely left. When they did leave, they had to be with chaperones because of the nature of the extreme interpretation of Islam that Islamic State took. They weren't participating in fighting. They weren't participating in terrorist plots. Now, yes, some of them did believe in Islamic State and what it stood for. I don't know if that's changed. It certainly had changed for all of them when we met them in the camp. It's very hard to imagine how these women and children could pose a real threat in the short term to Australia.
Dylan, if I can just finally ask you, this isn't the first group of returning families from Syria. 2019, the Morrison government repatriated 8 orphaned children. In 2022, the Albanese brought home 4 women and 13 children. This time around, the government has been very clear they haven't participated or aided the return of this group. They're arguing that the remaining cohort, the circumstances are more complicated. How do you interpret that?
I think that the government takes the view that the remaining women maybe are more likely to be charged. So they've spent more time essentially working on getting briefs together with which to charge these women. I mean, I'm not in a position to know the reality of that. I think the simple fact is all of these women, from the orphans that were brought home in 2019 through to these 4 women, and let's not forget 9 children that are coming home, are Australian citizens, and they should be entitled to the same kind of rights that any other Australian citizen is entitled to. Primary among them is the right to come home.